Hi, hello everyone. This is the first part of the series of video tutorials that would teach you to repair motherboard at a component level, that is at a chip level repair. So this is the gigabyte motherboard, PC motherboard. The make and the model number of the motherboard are shown here. This is gigabyte, the make. The model number is GAG31M ES2L. So in this video tutorial we will try to identify different ports, different connectors and sections, different slots, the components, chips present on the motherboard. Let us start with the brain of the computer, that is CPU. CPU stands for Central Processing Unit, and this socket which holds the CPU is called a CPU socket. The back end of the CPU is look like this, and this is, we call it as a pinless processor. So the socket we call it as LGA type socket. LGA stands for land grid array. There is another type of socket called PGA socket. PGA stands for pin grid array, and laptops they use a PGA type of socket. And near to the CPU we have a large chip present here, and actually what we are able to see here is only heat sink, and below this heat sink we have a chip which look like this. This chip we call it as a north bridge. Another name for north bridge is GMCH. GMCH stands for graphic memory controller hub. And another very large scale integrated circuit, a large chip present near to the north bridge is we call it as a south bridge, and here we are seeing only the heat sink again. So below this heat sink we have a chip which look like this. This we call it as a south bridge. Another name for south bridge is ICH. ICH stands for Input Output Controller Hub. And north bridge and south bridge together we call it as a chipset. And both north bridge and south bridge comes in a package called BGA type. BGA package. BGA stands for ball grid array. So after chipset, the largest IC present on the motherboard is SIO chip. SIO stands for Super Input Output Controller. So it comes in a package called QFP package, quad flat pack. You are able to see the pins here. In BGA type the pins are not visible to the outside, and the SIO chip in desktop motherboard always comes in a QFP package and with 128 pins. Total number of pins is always fixed 128 pins. The pin here, the arrow mark over here indicates that the pin counting has to be started from here 1, 38, 64 and up to 128. To make the pin counting easy, there is a mark, white mark being given here for every 10 pins, 10, 20, 30, 40 and so on. So here comes the BIOS chip. BIOS stands for Basic Input Output System. So in this motherboard they used two BIOS, dual BIOS. One we call it as M BIOS, main BIOS. Another one is B BIOS, backup BIOS. But normally in desktops they use only a single BIOS. So another name for BIOS is FWH. FWH stands for Firmware Hub. Since BIOS is neither completely hardware, not a software embedded into a hardware, we call it as firmware. And here comes the audio IC of the motherboard. So the audio IC is always present at top left portion of the motherboard near the audio port. This is the audio port, this is the audio IC, and have a closer look. So it also comes in QFP package, quad flat pack, and there are several capacitors will be present here to the audio IC. This audio IC we call it as actually audio codec chip. Codec stands for coder decoder. It is used to convert an analog signals into digital signals and digital to analog, that is coding and decoding. And here comes the audio voltage regulator. This regulator gives a supply of 5 volts to the audio IC. So here it is the LAN IC. The LAN IC is always will be near to the LAN port. So here is the LAN IC, sometimes also called as Ethernet IC. And normally there will be a crystal near to the LAN IC whose frequency is 25 megahertz. But in this motherboard they did not use the crystal. Instead, a coil and a resistor combination is used to generate the required frequency. So another important IC is clock IC. So the clock IC comes in a TSOP package. So TSOP means thin small outline package, and near to the clock IC there will always be a crystal whose frequency is 14.318 megahertz. And here we have a jumper over here. This we call it as a BIOS configuration jumper or CMOS clear jumper. When the jumper is open, these two pins are open, then it is in normal position. When it is a jumper is placed over these pins, it will be in called clear position. And normally the motherboards use a 3-pin jumper. When it is a 3-pin, 1, 2 is the normal position, 2, 3 will be the clear position. And here comes the battery. This battery we call it as a CMOS battery. CMOS stands for complementary metal oxide semiconductor. And the voltage of this battery is 3 volts. And this battery is also called as RTC battery. RTC stands for real time clock. And this battery is used to give supply to the RTC circuit, that is real time clock circuit, to maintain the system date and time in sync even when the PC is switched off. So here we have another crystal whose frequency is 32.768 kilohertz near to the south bridge. We call it as RTC crystal. And this section which is near to the CPU, we call it as a VRM section. VRM stands for voltage regulator module. So this the purpose of this section is to give out supply to the processor. So when 12 volts, this is a 12 volt connector, PS connector. When 12 volts, the VRM section takes the 12 volts as the input and gives out a supply to the processor, which we call it as a CPU core voltage. And there are several components present in the VRM section, like transistors, the coils, the capacitors, and more IC, which we call it as a VRM IC. This VRM IC is sometimes referred as PWM IC or oscillator IC or regulator IC. So here 1, 2, 3 coils are present, which indicates that is a 3-phase circuit. And these ports are called the back end ports. So this is a PS2 connector, this is a mouse connector, this is keyboard connector. PS2 stands for personal system 2. This is, we call it as a parallel port, which is used to connect printers and scanners. The serial port. So it is a VGA port to connect a monitor. VGA stands for video graphic array or video graphic adapter. This is a universal serial bus ports. This is a LAN port and 2 more USB ports. This is audio port, line in, line out, and the mic is connected over here. Here comes the power supply connector, ATX PS connector. ATX stands for Advanced Technology Extended. 20 or 24 connectors will be there. Through this connector we give the supply to the every part of the motherboard except CPU. The CPU draws its required voltage from the VRM section, and VRM section is fed with this 12 volts. This we call it as a 4 pin 12 volt ATX connector. And this green color port that we see is the called IDE connector, IDE port. IDE stands for Integrated Device Electronics. So it is also called a PATA. PATA means Parallel Advanced Technology Attachment. Here it is clearly written as an IDE over here. This port is used to connect the drives, that is a CD drive or DVD drive or hard disk drive. So besides PATA, there is another kind of technology which is called SATA. These ports are used to connect the SATA drives, the SATA hard disk or SATA drives, DVD drive or CD drive. The SATA stands for Serial Advanced Technology Attachment. So these yellow color ports that we see, slots that we see here are called DIMM slot or RAM slot or memory slots. They hold the primary memory, that is RAM memory. The DIMM stands for Dual Inline Memory Module. So at the center of this DIMM slot, on the notch there is a voltage is written here. It is 1.8 volts here. So this voltage indicates that this motherboard uses a DDR2 type of the RAM. So if it is 2.5 volts, then this motherboard uses the DDR1 RAM. If it is 1.5 volts, then it indicates that the motherboard uses DDR3 type of RAM. And the total number of pins in a DDR2 type DIMM slot are 240. The pin counting is 1 to 20 and 121 to 240. At the middle of this DIMM slot, this central notch divides the total number of pins 120 into 64 plus 56. And these two white color slots we call it as a PCI slot, peripheral component interface. There are two lines over here, one we call it as A, another one B. The pin counting has to start from here. These are used to connect the peripheral components. And this we call it as a PCI Express slot. It is more faster than the PCI communication, PCI Express communication we call it as. And this port we call it as AGP. AGP stands for Accelerated Graphic Port. It holds the graphic cards. And here comes the front panel connector. Front panel connector, we connect the power switch, the reset switch, power LED and hard disk LED. So the front panel connector has a total number of pins 10, but here the 10th pin being the no connection or dummy pin. So the pin that is diagonally opposite to the 10th pin is 1. The pin counting is like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So the two pins which are adjacent to the 10th pin will be the power switch pins. We connect the power switch here, and opposite to the power switch we connect a reset switch, 5 and 7 pins, and adjacent to the power switch we connect a power LED, that is 2 and 4, and opposite to the power LED we connect a HD LED for these two pins, that is 1 and 3. So this is the CPU fan connector. We connect the processor fan to this connector. This is system fan or rear fan connector. We connect the fan mounted on the cabinet to this connector. These two ports are called USB ports, front USB. And this connector, which is near to the audio port, is used to connect the front audio connections.